Weird Tales is an American fantasy and horror fiction pulp magazine founded by J.C.Henneberger and J.M. first published in March 1923. The first editor, Edwin Baird, printed early work by H.P. Lovecraft, Seabury Quinn, and Clark Ashton Smith, all of whom would go on to be popular writers. But within a year the magazine was in financial trouble. Henneberger sold his interest in the publisher, Rural Publishing Corporation, to Lansinger and refinanced Weird Tales, with Farnsworth Wright as the new editor. The first issue under Wright's control was dated November 1924. The magazine was more successful under Wright, and despite occasional financial setbacks it prospered over the next 15 years. Under Wright's control the magazine lived up to its subtitle, The Unique Magazine, and published a wide range of unusual fiction. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos stories first appeared in Weird Tales, starting with The Call of Cthulhu in 1928. These were well received, and a group of writers associated with Lovecraft wrote additional stories set in the same milieu. Robert E. Howard was a regular contributor, and published several of his Conan the Barbarian stories in the magazine, and Seabury Quinn's series of stories about Jules de Grandin, a detective who specialized in cases involving the supernatural, was very popular with the readers. Other well-liked authors included Nick Zandailos, E. Hoffman Price, Robert Bloch, and H. Warner Munn. Wright published some science fiction, along with the fantasy and horror, partly because when Weird Tales was launched there were no magazines specializing in science fiction, but he continued this policy even after the launch of magazines such as Amazing Stories in 1926. Edmund Hamilton wrote a good deal of science fiction for Weird Tales, though after a few years he used the magazine for his more fantastic stories, and submitted his space operas elsewhere. In 1938 the magazine was sold to William Delaney, the publisher of short stories, and within 2 years Wright, who was ill, was replaced by Dorothy McIlwraith as editor. Although some successful new authors and artists such as Ray Bradbury and Hannes Bok continued to appear, the magazine is considered by critics to have declined under McIlwraith from its heyday in the 1930s. In 1954 Weird Tales ceased publication, but since then numerous attempts have been made to relaunch the magazine. Starting in 1973, the longest-lasting version began in 1988 and ran with an occasional hiatus for over 20 years under an assortment of publishers. In the mid-1990s the title was changed to Worlds of Fantasy and Amp Horror because of licensing issues, with the original title returning in 1998. As of 2016, the most recent published issue was dated spring 2014. The magazine is regarded by historians of fantasy and science fiction as a legend in the field, with Robert Weinberg, author of A History of the Magazine, considering it the most important and influential of all fantasy magazines. Weinberg's fellow historian, Mike Ashley, is more cautious, describing it as second only to Unknown in significance and influence, adding that, somewhere in the imagination reservoir of all U.S. genre fantasy and horror writers is part of the spirit of Weird Tales. Background: in the late 19th century popular magazines typically did not print fiction to the exclusion of other content. They would include non-fiction, articles and poetry as well. In October 1896, the Frank A. Munsey Company's Argosy magazine was the first to switch to printing only fiction, and in December of that year it changed to using cheap wood pulp paper. This is now regarded by magazine historians as having been the start of the pulp magazine era. For years pulp magazines were successful without restricting the fiction content to any specific genre, but in 19 1906, Munsey launched Railroad Man's magazine, the first title that focused on a particular niche. Other titles that specialized in particular fiction genres followed, starting in 1915 with Detective Story magazine, with Western Story magazine following in 1919. Weird fiction, science fiction, and fantasy all appeared frequently in the pulps of the day, but by the early 1920s there was still no single magazine focused on any of these genres, though the Thrill book, launched in 1919 by Street and Amp Smith with the intention of printing different or unusual stories, was a near miss. In 1922, J.C.Henneberger, a journalist and magazine editor who had been publishing College Humor and Magazine of Fun, formed Rural Publishing Corporation of Chicago in partnership with J.M. Lansinger. The first venture was Detective Tales, a pulp magazine that appeared twice a month, starting with the October 1, 1922 issue. It was initially unsuccessful, and as part of a refinancing plan, Henneberger decided to publish an additional magazine that would allow him to split some of his costs between the two titles. Henneberger had long been an admirer of Edgar Allan Poe, so he created a fiction magazine that would focus on horror, and titled it Weird Tales. Publication history. Rural Publishing Corporation. Henneberger chose Edwin Baird, the editor of Detective Tales, to edit Weird Tales. Farnsworth Wright was first reader, and Otis Adelbert Klein also worked on the magazine, assisting Baird. Payment rates were low, usually between 1/4 and 1/2 cent per word. The budget went up to 1 cent per word for the most popular writers. Sales were initially poor, and Henneberger soon decided to change the format from the standard pulp size to large pulp, in order to make the magazine more visible. This had little long-term effect on sales, though the first issue at the new size, dated May 1923, was the only one that first year to sell out completely, probably because it contained the first installment of a popular serial, The Moon Terror, by A.G. Birch. The magazine lost a considerable amount of money under Baird's editorship. After 13 issues, the total debt was over $40,000. In the meantime, Detective Tales had been retitled Real Detective Tales and was making a profit, as was College Humor. Henneberger decided to sell both magazines to Lansinger and invest the money in Weird Tales. This did not address the $40,000 in debts, much of which was owed to the magazine's printer. The printing company was owned by B. Cornelius, who agreed to Henneberger's suggestion that the debt should be converted to a majority interest in a new company, Popular Fiction Publishing. This did not eliminate all of the magazine's debts, but it meant that Weird Tales could continue to publish and perhaps return to profitability. Cornelius agreed that if the magazine ever became profitable enough to repay him the $40,000 he had been owed, he would give up his shares in the company. Cornelius became the company treasurer. The business manager was William Sprenger, who had been working for Rural Publishing. Henneberger had hopes of eventually refinancing the debt with the help of another printer, Hall Printing Company, owned by Robert Eastman. Baird stayed with Lansinger, so Henneberger wrote to H.P. Lovecraft, who had sold some stories to Weird Tales, to see if he would be interested in taking the job. Henneberger offered 10 weeks advance pay, but made it a condition that Lovecraft moved to Chicago, where the magazine was headquartered. Lovecraft described Henneberger's plans in a letter to Frank Belknap long as a brand new magazine to cover the field of Pomac and Shudders. Lovecraft did not wish to leave New York, where he had recently moved with his new bride. His dislike of cold weather was another deterrent. He spent several months considering the offer in mid-1924 without making a final decision, with Henneberger visiting him in Brooklyn more than once. But eventually either he declined or Henneberger simply gave up. By the end of the year, Wright had been hired as the new editor of Weird Tales. The last issue under Baird's name was a combined May, June, July issue, with 192 pages, a much thicker magazine than the earlier issues. It was assembled by Wright and Klein, rather than Baird. Popular fiction publishing Henneberger gave Wright full control of Weird Tales, and did not get involved with story selection. In about 1921, Wright had begun to suffer from Parkinson's disease, and over the course of his editorship the symptoms grew gradually worse. By the end of the 1920s he was unable to sign his name, and by the late 1930s Bill Sprenger was helping him get to work and back home. The first issue with Wright as editor was dated November 1924, and the magazine immediately resumed a regular monthly schedule, with the format changing back to pulp again. The pay rate was initially low, with a cap of half a cent per word until 1926, when the top rate was increased to 1 cent per word. Some of popular fiction publishing's debts were paid off over time, and the highest pay rate eventually rose to 1.5 cents per word. Although popular fiction publishing continued to be based in Chicago, the editorial offices were in Indianapolis for a while, at 2 separate addresses, but moved to Chicago towards the end of 1926. After a short period on North Broadway, the office moved to 840 North Michigan Avenue, where it would remain until 1938. In 1927, popular fiction publishing issued Birch's The Moon Terror, one of Weird Tales' more popular serials, as a hardcover book, including 3 other stories from the magazine's first year. One of the stories, An Adventure in the Fourth Dimension, was by Wright himself. The book sold poorly, and it remained on offer in the pages of Weird Tales, at reduced prices, for 20 years. It was at one point provided as a bonus to readers who subscribed. In 1930, Cornelius launched companion magazine, Oriental Stories, but the magazine was not a success, though it managed to last for over 3 years before Cornelius gave up. Another financial blow occurred in late 1930 when a bank failure froze most of the magazine's cash. Henneberger changed the schedule to bi-monthly, starting with the February-March 1931 issue. 6 months later, with the August 1931 issue, the monthly schedule returned. 2 years later, Weird Tales Bank was still having financial problems, and payment to authors was being substantially delayed. The Depression also hit the Hall Printing Company, which Henneberger had been hoping would take over the debt from Cornelius. Robert Eastman, the owner of Hall, at one point was unable to meet payroll. Eastman died in 1934, and with him went Henneberger's plans for recovering control of Weird Tales. The magazine advertised in the early science fiction pulps, usually highlighting one of the more science-fictional stories. Often the advertised story was by Edmund Hamilton, who was popular in the SF magazines. Wright also sold hardcovers of books by some of his more popular authors, such as Klein, in the pages of Weird Tales. Although the magazine was never greatly profitable, Wright was paid well. Robert Weinberg, author of A History of Weird Tales, records a rumor that Wright was unpaid for much of his work on the magazine. But according to E. Hoffman Price, a close friend of Wright's who occasionally read manuscripts for him, Weird Tales was paying Wright about $600 a month in 1927. Delaney Cornelius retired in 1938, and popular fiction publishing was sold to William J. Delaney, who was the publisher of short stories, a successful general fiction pulp magazine based in New York. Sprenger and Wright both received a share of the stock from Cornelius. Sprenger did not remain with the company, but Wright moved to New York and stayed on as editor. Henneberger's share of popular fiction publishing was converted to a small interest in the new company, Weird Tales, Inc., a subsidiary of Delaney's Short Stories, Inc. Dorothy McElraith, the editor of Short Stories, became Wright's assistant, and over the next 2 years Delaney tried to increase profits by adjusting the page count and price. An increase from 144 pages to 160 pages starting with the February 1939 issue, along with the use of cheaper paper, made the magazine thicker, but this failed to increase sales. In September 1939 the page count went down to 128, and the price was cut from 25 cents to 15 cents. From January 1940 the frequency was reduced by monthly, a change which stayed in effect until the end of the magazine's run 14 years later. None of these changes had the intended effect, and sales continued to languish. In March 1940, Wright left and was replaced by McElraith as editor. Histories of the magazine differ as to whether he was fired because of poor sales, or quit because of his health. He was by now suffering from Parkinson's so severely that he had trouble walking unassisted. Wright then had an operation to reduce the pain with which he suffered, but never fully recovered. He died in June of that year. McElraith's first issue was dated April 1940. She was assisted by Lamont Buchanan, who worked for her as associate editor and art editor for both Weird Tales and Short Stories. August Deleth also provided assistance and advice, although he had no formal connection with the magazine. Most of McElraith's budget went to Short Stories. Since that was the more successful magazine, the payment rate for fiction in Weird Tales by 1953 was 1 cent per word, well below the top rates of other science fiction and fantasy magazines of the day. War shortages also caused problems, and the page count was reduced, first to 112 pages in 1943, and then to 96 pages the following year. The price was increased to 20 cents in 1947, and again to 25 cents in 1949. But it was not only Weird Tales that was suffering, the entire pulp industry was in decline. Delaney switched the format to digest with the September 1953 issue, but there was to be no reprieve. In 1954, Weird Tales and Short Stories ceased publication. In both cases the last issue was dated September 1954. 1970s and early 1980s. In the mid-1950s, Leo Margulis, a well-known figure in the magazine publishing world, launched a new company, Renown Publications, with plans to publish several titles. He acquired the rights to both Weird Tales and Short Stories, and hoped to bring both magazines back. He abandoned a plan to restart Weird Tales in 1962, using reprints from the original magazine. After being advised by Sam Moskowitz that there was little market for weird and horror fiction at the time, instead Margulis mined the Weird Tales back file for 4 anthologies which appeared in the early 1960s. The Unexpected, The Ghoul Keepers, Weird Tales, and Worlds of Weird. The latter two were ghost-edited by Moskowitz, who proposed to Margulis that when the time was right to start the magazine up again, it should include reprints from obscure sources that Moskowitz had found, rather than just stories reprinted from the first incarnation of Weird Tales. These stories would be as good as new for most readers, and the money saved could be used for an occasional news story. The new version of Weird Tales finally appeared from Renown Publications in April 1973, edited by Moskowitz. It had weak distribution and sales were too low for sustainability. According to Moskowitz, the average sales were 18,000 copies per issue. well short of the 23,000 that would have been needed for the magazine to survive. The fourth issue, dated summer 1974, was the last, as Margulies closed down all his magazines except for Mike Shane Mystery Magazine, which was the only one that was making a profit. Mike Ashley of Science Fiction Magazine historian records that Moskowitz was unwilling to continue in any case, as he was annoyed by Margulies' detailed involvement in the day-to-day editorial tasks such as editing manuscripts and writing introductions. Margulies died the following year, and his widow, Sylvia Margulies, decided to sell the rights to the title. Forrest Ackerman of Science Fiction Fan and editor was one of the interested parties, but she chose instead to sell to Victor Drix and Robert Weinberg. Weinberg in turn licensed the title to Lynn Carter, who interested a publisher, Zebra Books, in the project. The result was a series of 4 paperback anthologies, edited by Lynn Carter, appearing between 1981 and 1983. These were originally planned to be quarterly, but in fact the first 2 both appeared in December 1980 and were both dated spring 1981. The next was dated fall 1981. Carter's rights to the title were terminated by Weinberg in 1982 for non-payment, but the 4th issue was already in the works and finally appeared with a date of summer 1983. In 1982, Sheldon Jaffrey and Roy Torgerson met with Weinberg to propose taking over as licensees, but Weinberg decided not to pursue the offer. The following year, Brian Forbes approached Weinberg with another offer. Forbes' company, the Bellerophon Network, was an imprint of a Los Angeles company named The Wizard. Ashley reports that Weinberg was only able to contact Forbes by phone, and even that was not always reliable, so negotiations were slow. Forbes' editorial director was Gordon Garb and the fiction editor was Gil Lamont. Forrest Ackerman also assisted, mainly by obtaining material to include. There was a good deal of confusion between the various participants in the project. According to Locus of Science Fiction Trade Journal, Ackerman says he has had no contact with publisher Forbes, does not know what will happen to the material he put together, and is as much in the dark as everybody else. Lamont says that he is still renegotiating his contract and is not sure where he stands. The original plan was for the first issue to appear in August 1984, dated July-August. But before it appeared, the decision was taken to change the contents, and a new, completely reset issue finally appeared at the end of the year, dated fall 1984. Even with this delay, a final agreement had not yet been reached with Weinberg over licensing. Only 12,500 copies were printed. These were sent to 2 distributors who both went into bankruptcy. As a result, few copies were sold, and Forbes was not paid by the distributors. Despite the financial setback, Forbes attempted to continue, and a second issue eventually appeared. Its cover date was winter 1985, but it was not published until June 1986. Few copies were printed. Reports vary between 1,500 and 2,300 in total. Mark Monzolo was the fiction editor, but Garb continued as editorial director. Lamont was no longer involved with the magazine. Terminus and Success's Weird Tales was more lastingly revived at the end of the 1980s by George H. Scythers, John Gregory Betancourt and Darrell Schweitzer, who formed Terminus Publishing, based in Philadelphia, and licensed the rights from Weinberg. Rather than focus on newsstand distribution, which was expensive and had become less effective in the 1980s, they planned to build a base of direct subscribers and distribute the magazine for sale through specialist stores. The first issue had a cover date of spring 1988, but it was produced early enough to be available at the 1987 World Fantasy Convention in Nashville, Tennessee. The size was the same as the original pulp version, though it was printed on better paper. There were also limited edition hardcover versions of each issue, signed by the contributors. A special World Fantasy Award Weird Tales received in 1992 made it apparent that the magazine was successful in terms of quality, but sales were insufficient to cover costs. To save money, the format was changed to a larger flat size, starting with the winter 1992-1993 issue. But the magazine remained in financial trouble, with issues becoming a irregular over the next couple of years. The summer 1993 issue was the last to have a hardcover edition. It was also the last, for a while, to bear the name Weird Tales, as Weinberg did not renew the license. The magazine was retitled Worlds of Fantasy and Amp Horror, and the volume numbering was restarted at Volume 1, Number 1. But in every other way the magazine was unchanged, and the 4 issues under this title, issued between 1994 and 1996, are regarded by bibliographers as part of the overall Weird Tales run. In April 1995, HBO announced they had plans to turn Weird Tales into a 3-episode anthology show similar to the Tales from the Crypt series. The deal for the rights was facilitated by screenwriters Mark Patrick Carducci and Peter Atkins. Directors Tim Burton, Francis Ford Coppola, and Oliver Stone were executive producers, with each one expected to direct an episode. Stone was to be director of the pilot. However, this series never came to fruition. No issues appeared in 1997, but in 1998 Seithers and Schweitzer negotiated a deal with Warren Lupine of DNA Publications which allowed them to start publishing Weird Tales under license once again. The first issue was dated summer 1998, and other than the omission of the winter 1998 issue, a regular quarterly schedule was maintained for the next 4.5 years. Sales were weak, never rising above 6,000 copies, and DNA began to experience financial difficulties. Wildside Press, owned by John Betancourt, joined DNA and Terminus Publishing as co-publisher, starting with the July-August 2003 issue, and Weird Tales returned to a mostly regular schedule for a few months. A long hiatus ended with the December 2004 issue, which appeared in early 2005. This was the last issue under the arrangement with DNA. Wildside Press then bought Weird Tales, and Betancourt again joined Seithers and Schweitzer as co-editor. The first Wildside Press edition appeared in September 2005, and starting with the following issue, dated February 2006, the magazine was able to stay on a more or less bi-monthly schedule for some time. In early 2007, Wildside announced a revamp of Weird Tales, naming Stephen H. Siegel the editorial and creative director, and later recruiting Anne Vandermeer as the new fiction editor. In January 2010, the magazine announced Siegel was leaving the top editorial post to become an editor at Quirk Books. Vandermeer was elevated to editor-in-chief. Mary Robinette Kowal joined the staff as art director, and Siegel became senior contributing editor. On August 23, 2011, John Betancourt announced that Wildside Press would be selling Weird Tales to Marvin Kaye and John Harlacher of NTH Dimension Media. Marvin Kaye took over chief editorial duties. Issue 359, the first under the new publishers, was published in late February 2012. Some months before the release of issue 359, a special World Fantasy Convention preview issue was given away for free to interested attendees. As of 2016, the most recent issue to appear was dated spring 2014.